Good afternoon. My name is Cheyne, and this afternoon we're going to be speaking about the linking of the oceans, and in particular Manifest Destiny, the rise of the USA and the building of the Panama Canal. Our story starts in 1803, when the third President of the Union, Thomas Jefferson, entered into a contract with the French Emperor Napoleon. Now, this suited both sides. The Americans had this vision that it was their manifest destiny to spread from the east coast of the United States to the west. Napoleon, Emperor of the French, needed cash for his constant wars against the other great powers of Europe. And for $15 million, he handed over the area known as Louisiana to the United States. Now that worked out at $18 per square mile, one of the best bargains in real estate history. For a territory that stretched from New Orleans right up the Mississippi to what is now modern Montana. Having purchased this, Jefferson was anxious to find out exactly what he had bought. He had a man in mind, Captain Meriwether Lewis, a skilled army commander with a knowledge of medicine, of botany, and a man who could read a map. Not that there were many maps to read in this part of the world. Jefferson charged him with mapping the lands that he was going to explore, to find a route to the Pacific Ocean, and to record the lives of the inhabitants, the fauna, the flora, and any natural resources that he'd encountered. Lewis took with him his trusty lieutenant, William Clark, and a small party of men set off from Charles, Missouri in 1804 in May. It was a long journey, heading into unknown territory, relying on the word of the Native Americans who lived in those parts through translators about the best route further west. They had to overwinter twice in North Dakota and then at the end of 1805 at the mouth of the Columbia River within sight of the Pacific Ocean. In spring 1806, they explored up and down the coast and then departed back for the east to report to President Jefferson exactly what they had found. Now, in one of those strange coincidences, they missed by a matter of weeks a ship that was sailing southward, the Juno. And it had on board one Nikolai Rezanov, a Russian aristocrat who had been charged with his company head, Nikolai Baranov, head of the Russia-American Company, to explore what were then the Russian lands in Northern America, what is now modern-day Alaska. Rezanov sailed from St. Petersburg across the Atlantic by way of Brazil, round Cape Horn and across the Pacific to Japan, and then on to the Russian Far East lands. And then he made his way along the coast of North America to the Russian settlement at Sitka. And what he found there alarmed him. They had collected plenty of wild pelts, particularly sea otters, for export back to Russia. But the colony was in dire straits in terms of basic supplies, particularly foodstuffs. Rezanov's mission then was to alleviate this, and he took ship and headed southwards. He came to what is now San Francisco, a settlement inhabited by the Spanish government and their officials. A small settlement, perhaps 200 or 300 strong. He had hoped to make contact with the commandant, but he was absent. But his son agreed to talk, and conversing in Latin between the ship's surgeon and the local priest, they managed to make clear that the Russians were in need of foodstuffs. Nikolai Rezanov was a good companion, and he regaled the family of the Commandant when he returned, with tales of life in St. Petersburg. And he made a particular impression on one Maria Consuelo de la Concepcion, only 15 years old, but she soon became smitten with Rezanov. He too returned her affections, and the two would talk through interpreters about life in old St. Petersburg. Time came for Rezanov to return, but before he did, he proposed marriage to young Maria. She agreed, to the consternation of her father. But eventually he was won round. He could see the advantages of an alliance with the Russians. Rezanov then had to go back to Sitka with the supplies that the Spaniards had given him, and then back to St. Petersburg to seek permission from the Tsar for this marriage. A journey overland that would normally take 2 years. Rezanov, on his return to Siberia, took ill. He went down with pneumonia 3 times. The 3rd time, near Krasnoyarsk, he was so weak that he fell off his horse and died. Maria waited and waited for word of her fiancé. And after 5 years, came word that Rezanov was in fact dead. Heartbroken, Maria went into a nunnery, refusing all other suitors. Indeed, this may well be the origin of the story of Madame Butterfly. Well, Rezanov had not died in vain. He had established good relations with the Spaniards. And a couple of years later, 1808, the Russians established Fort Ross just north of San Francisco. Not a Scottish fort. Fort Ross was short for Fort Russia. And there they built a fort, they built an Orthodox church, and they began to cultivate the lands as best they could to provide supplies for their countrymen back in Sitka. They hadn't chosen particularly well. The climate in that part of California was not all that conducive to growing of crops. But they did manage to introduce apples, peaches. In fact, the first peaches grown in North America on that side of the coast were in fact based on Russian stock. The colony did not prosper, however, and in 1833 the Russians gave up and sold their interest to one John Sutter. Thank you for listening.